The transmission hit the command deck like a whispered curse. A low hum filled the air as the encrypted signal unraveled, revealing static at first, then the screams. Darius Kane stood frozen, his pulse pounding against his skull. He had seen battle. He had watched men die. But this was something else. The screen flickered, revealing a dimly lit chamber, bodies piled like discarded meat. A human man, if he could still be called that, knelt in the center, his face gaunt, his ribs exposed through torn flesh. His breathing was ragged, uneven. Shadows moved around him. Grotesque figures barely visible, but their voices slithered through the audio, guttural and filled with amusement. The man lifted his head, his eyes burning with something unnatural, defiance. If there are still free men among the stars, hear me. His voice was hoarse, barely holding together, but his words cut through the static like steel through bone. He coughed, crimson spilling from his lips. The camera zoomed out, revealing others. Humans stripped of dignity, chained like cattle. One woman sobbed. Another stared blankly at the floor. Already gone in every way, but physically. The Vrak's overseer stepped forward, a towering, insectoid thing with shifting plates of obsidian black carapace. It exhaled something close to a laugh. These creatures call themselves warriors. It hissed, its multiple eyes narrowing with sick pleasure. They call themselves conquerors. But look at them now, broken, pitiful, weak. The man on his knees didn't flinch. Instead, he grinned through cracked teeth. You think we're weak? He rasped. You think this will break us? His body shuddered, but he forced himself upright. The Vrak's overseer tilted its head. Tell me, human, it said mockingly, do you wish to beg? No. A long pause. The overseer's mandibles clicked. The man's gaze burned into the camera. Do not rescue us, he whispered. We are beyond saving. But you, my brothers, my sisters, do not forget us. He took a breath that sounded like it could be his last. Do not show them mercy. The overseer's claw sliced across his throat. His body collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. The screen flickered, and then the transmission ended. Silence suffocated the room. Kane's fingers curled into fists, his jaw locking tight. Around him, officers and analysts stood frozen, expressions caught between horror and rage. The war had ended 2 decades ago. Peace treaties had been signed. The galaxy had moved on. And yet here it was, proof that the Vraks had never stopped, that humanity had been bled behind closed doors, turned into entertainment for the monsters of the void. Fleet Command would hesitate. They would debate, weigh political consequences, stall. But Kane? He didn't hesitate. He turned to his comm officer, voice like gravel. Transmit that footage to every colony, every fleet, every outpost. I don't give a damn about protocol. The officer hesitated. Sir, that's... Do it. The room remained still for a breath. Then the officer nodded and relayed the command. The broadcast spread like wildfire. Within hours, every Terran world had seen it, and the reaction was immediate. Outrage, fury, a storm of voices demanding retribution. The military, once shackled by bureaucracy, was now unchained. A war council was called within the day. Admirals, generals, fleet captains, men and women who had fought and bled for the Dominion gathered in the war room. Holographic displays lit up with fleet movements, enemy positions, attack vectors. High command urged caution, diplomacy. Kane spoke once, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade. No more peace. No more talks. The Vraks don't get to exist. A silence followed. No one argued. The decision had already been made, not by politicians but by the people. The Judgment Armada was formed that night. Ships were pulled from every sector. Fleets that had once stood as defensive bulwarks now moved as one. A singular force with a singular purpose. The march to war was not methodical. It was a storm, a force of nature that the Vraks had never expected. The first strike came swift and merciless. Vraks' border worlds, once thought untouchable, burned within hours. Their fleet scrambled to defend, but they were too slow, too arrogant. The first planet fell without a single Terran casualty. The second followed the same fate. The third, there were no survivors. Kane led from the front. His ship, the Iron Requiem, tore through enemy lines like a beast unchained. His voice carried through comm channels like a war hymn. No hesitation. No prisoners. Make them fear us. The Vraks tried to counter. They sent their warlords, their armadas, their dreadnoughts built from the bones of conquered species. It didn't matter. Humanity did not fight like the others. They did not seek balance or compromise. They struck like predators, relentless, unyielding. Prison camps were found along the way, hidden facilities where humans had been kept, experimented on, broken. The soldiers who stormed those camps did not return as they had entered. They emerged changed, wrathful. They took no prisoners. They made no exceptions. And still, the war escalated. The Vraks' homeworld loomed on the horizon, their final bastion, their throne of cruelty. High Command sent transmissions urging Kane to negotiate, to consider the long-term consequences of genocide. Kane's response was short. They should have thought of that before they made us monsters. The final battle was not a battle. It was slaughter. The Vraks' fleets fell in waves, unable to withstand the fury of a species, pushed beyond its limits. Their defenses crumbled, their weapons silenced. The last transmission from their supreme overlord came as a desperate plea. We surrender. No reply came. The Judgment Armada rained fire upon their world. In the aftermath, there was no celebration, no speeches of victory. There was only silence. Humanity had won. And in doing so, they had become something else. Kane stood on the bridge of the Iron Requiem, staring into the abyss of space, knowing that somewhere the galaxy watched and whispered a new name for his people: executioners. The silence after the massacre was unbearable. Across the bridge of the Iron Requiem, the air was thick with something unspoken. Victory had been declared, but no one celebrated. The Vraks' homeworld was gone, turned into an unrecognizable wasteland. Its surface cracked and burning. Millions had perished, and not one Terran soul felt an ounce of regret. Darius Kane stood at the center of it all, his gaze locked on the ruined planet through the viewport, his face unreadable. The weight of what had been done sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was no hesitation, no doubt. He had seen the broadcast. He had heard the screams. He had watched them die. And now, so had the rest of the galaxy. A transmission cut through the silence, a signal patched directly to the bridge. High Command, their voices, usually calm, now carried an edge of desperation. Kane, you need to stand down. The Council is demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities. The galactic order is on the verge of collapse. You've made your point. The war is over. Kane didn't respond. His fingers drummed once against the console, his mind processing the words but discarding them as irrelevant. The war isn't over, he said finally, his voice low, almost dangerous. The war ends when the Vraks cease to exist. You've already destroyed their homeworld, the voice on the other end argued. They have nothing left. They can't retaliate. They can't recover. This is extermination. Kane, you're turning humanity into something the rest of the galaxy will fear. He exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving the burning husk below. Good. A long silence followed. Then another voice joined the line, one he recognized immediately. Admiral Lorne, his former mentor, his oldest ally, a man who had once fought beside him, now reduced to pleading. Darius, Lorne's voice was heavy. Listen to me. I understand why you did this. We all saw what they did. But you need to stop now. You've sent the message. If you go any further, we won't be able to control what happens next. The council is afraid. Our allies are afraid. You keep pushing, and they won't see us as avengers. They'll see us as monsters. Kane's grip tightened on the edge of the console. He respected Lorne, maybe even still admired him, but there was a difference between them now. Lorne still believed in diplomacy, in restraint. Kane had buried that part of himself the moment he watched that man die in the broadcast. I don't care what the council thinks. I don't care what the other species think. We were never meant to be conquerors, but we were never meant to be prey either. We let them think we were weak. We let them think they could take our people, rip them apart, and laugh while they did it. We let them think there would be no consequences. His voice dropped, cold and sharp as a blade. They were wrong. Lorne sighed. The sound weighted with something that felt dangerously close to resignation. You're forcing my hand, Darius? No, Kane said simply. You forced mine when you hesitated. He cut the transmission before the Admiral could respond. The silence stretched long after the comms went dead. His officers remained at their stations, saying nothing, waiting for his next command. He knew what they were thinking. They had followed him this far, but there was a line. He had already crossed it. How much further would he go? How much more would he demand from them? He turned to his second-in-command, a hardened veteran named Locke, a man who had once been skeptical of Kane's methods, but had fought beside him regardless. Locke, Kane said, send a message to all fleet captains. We're moving on the next Vrax outpost. No delays, no negotiations. Locke hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Kane saw the flicker of doubt, the lingering remnants of a soldier still clinging to morality. Sir, we just wiped out an entire world. Their military is shattered. Their leadership is dead. There's no one left to fight. You keep pushing, and this isn't war anymore. It's annihilation. Kane's expression didn't change. They didn't stop at one world when they came for us. They didn't hesitate when they carved up our people. You saw the broadcast, Locke. You saw what they did. Tell me, honestly, that you think leaving them alive is a good idea? Locke swallowed, his jaw tight. It doesn't matter what I think. It matters what this makes us. Kane stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough that only Locke could hear. What this makes us, he said slowly, deliberately, is safe. Locke didn't look away. For a moment, Kane thought he might argue, might push back, but then the man gave a curt nod and turned to relay the orders. Kane watched him go, watched as the officers who had once followed him without question now carried something new in their expressions. Uncertainty, fear, not of the enemy, of him. The realization didn't bother him as much as it should have. Hours later, the fleet moved. The next target was a Vrax military outpost, a stronghold deep within what had once been their controlled space. When they arrived, there was no fight. No resistance. The Vrax, for the first time in history, surrendered without firing a single shot. Kane stood on the deck, staring at the surrender transmission, watching as the Vrax commander, a creature that would have once sneered, now quivered in its armor, its voice shaking. We submit, it said. We offer no resistance. Please spare us. Kane exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the console. Once this would have been the moment for diplomacy. Once humanity would have accepted this surrender, would have taken prisoners, would have held trials, would have shown restraint. That was before the broadcast, before the screams, before the execution, before the blood. He leaned forward, pressing a single button. The fleet opened fire. No mercy, no survivors. The transmission cut as the outpost exploded into nothingness. And the silence that followed was different this time. He turned, looking across the bridge, meeting the gazes of his crew. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty. They had made their choice, just as he had made his. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a purge. The fleet moved like a storm, an unrelenting force sweeping through Vrak space, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. The surrender of the outpost had changed something fundamental. The Vraks, once arrogant, once unyielding in their cruelty, had finally broken. Their transmissions, once filled with sneering threats, now carried only desperation. Every intercepted message was the same. Pleas for mercy, frantic attempts to negotiate, frantic attempts to survive. But mercy was no longer in the vocabulary of humanity. The war had long since passed the point of reason. This was no longer about politics, strategy, or control. This was retribution. And retribution had no limit. Darius Kane stood at the helm of the Iron Requiem, his face unreadable as he listened to the latest intelligence reports. The last remaining strongholds of the Vraks' dominion had collapsed into chaos, their fleets abandoning their posts, their civilians fleeing into deep space. There was nowhere left for them to run, no allies to turn to. The rest of the galaxy had watched in stunned silence as humanity, once known for its diplomacy and restraint, had turned into something else, something relentless, something that did not forgive. Admiral, Locke's voice was measured, but there was something beneath it, something unsettled. We've received a transmission from the Galactic Council. They're calling for an immediate ceasefire. They're threatening sanctions, embargoes, retaliation if we don't stop now. Kane exhaled, his fingers tapping against the steel railing. Sanctions, he repeated, almost amused. From the same council that turned a blind eye while our people were butchered. From the same leaders who signed treaties while the Vraks tortured and killed. From the same fools who sat and watched while we suffered. His voice dropped, cold and sharp. No, Locke hesitated, his jaw tight. They're afraid of us, Kane. They're afraid of what we've become. Good, Kane said, turning to face him. Let them be afraid. Another officer stepped forward, a transmission held in his hands. Sir, we've intercepted another message. It's from the Vraks' Supreme Overseer. What's left of him? Anyway, he's offering complete, unconditional surrender. Their empire is finished. He's begging for his people to be spared. Kane took the data pad, scrolling through the message, his expression betraying nothing. The Vraks' leader's words were fragmented, desperate. He spoke of survival, of reparations, of peace. He spoke of regret. He spoke of weakness. He spoke of terror. Kane read it twice, letting the weight of it settle. Then he crushed the data pad in his grip and let the broken pieces clatter to the floor. Sir, Locke said, more urgently now, this is it. They've lost. If we keep going, we don't just destroy their military. We erase them. We erase their entire species. Kane's gaze was unwavering, and Locke's breath hitched for a moment, his hands tightening into fists. And that's not who we are. Kane's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Isn't it? The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Around them, officers exchanged wary glances. There was no denying the truth anymore. The war had changed them. Kane had changed them. Once they had fought for survival. Then they had fought for vengeance. But now they fought because there was nothing left but the fight itself. Another transmission came through, cutting through the tension like a blade. Sir, the comms officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the last Vraks colony, the last civilian population. They're transmitting their surrender. Kane turned to the viewport, staring out into the abyss of space where the final remnants of the Vraks people waited. A species that had once been the terror of the stars, now reduced to cowering refugees. Their survival hanging on a single decision, his decision. Locke stepped forward, his voice lower, more personal now. Kane, he said, no rank, no title. Just a man speaking to another man. End it. Here. Now. Kane didn't respond. He stared at the transmission, at the surrender, at the remnants of the enemy who had once taken everything from them. He thought of the broadcast, the screams, the man's final words. Do not show them mercy. His fingers hovered over the command panel. One order, one final strike. The fleet would follow without question. The last of the wracks would burn. Humanity's vengeance would be complete. But something held him there. Something buried deep beneath the rage, beneath the war, beneath the blood. Something distant, something human. He closed his eyes for the first time in what felt like years. And then, slowly, his hand dropped from the controls. Ceasefire, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Locke's shoulders sagged with relief. The officers around them exhaled, tension slowly seeping out of the room. The fleet relayed the command. And across the void, the last Vrax colony remained untouched. The war was over. Kane turned away from the viewport, his face unreadable. The galaxy had changed. Humanity had changed. And so had he. The war had ended. But the legend of Darius Kane had only just begun. The bridge of the Iron Requiem remained silent. The weight of the last command still hanging in the air. Ceasefire. It had been a single word, but it had shaken the entire fleet. The order had spread through the ranks, met with disbelief, confusion, even resistance. After everything. After the blood, after the fire, after the unrelenting slaughter. Darius Kane had stopped. The storm had stilled. The war had ended. But the silence that followed was suffocating. Locke exhaled slowly, his gaze searching Kane's face, but there was nothing to read there. No sign of regret, no relief. Just the same cold steel that had carried them through the war. The officers on the bridge, hardened soldiers who had followed him without question, now looked at him with something different. Not doubt, not quite, but something close. They had expected an execution. Instead, they had been given restraint, and restraint felt foreign now. A chime broke the quiet. The Galactic Council's signal pulsed on the main console. Locke's fingers hovered over it before glancing at Kane. He nodded, and the transmission opened. The council chamber appeared, a grand hall filled with representatives of dozens of species, all watching Kane with varying degrees of caution and relief. The human representative, a man who had spent the entirety of the war begging for diplomacy, leaned forward. Admiral Kane. His voice was carefully measured. Humanity's actions in this war have changed the balance of the galaxy. There are those who see you as a hero, a liberator, a force of justice. But there are others, many others, who see what you've done and call it something else. Kane didn't move, didn't blink. And what do they call it? The man hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Genocide. A ripple of murmurs spread through the council, some nodding in agreement, others remaining silent. Kane let the words settle, rolling it through his mind. It didn't sting. It didn't cut. It simply existed. You gave the order for a ceasefire. The man continued, careful, deliberate. And for that, the council acknowledges your restraint. But we cannot ignore the destruction. We cannot ignore the consequences of what has been done. The Vrax Dominion is gone. Their leadership is eradicated. Their military is dust. What remains are scattered survivors, refugees who... They're alive because I allowed it, Kane interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying enough weight to silence the room. His gaze swept across the gathered delegates, unflinching. They had every chance to surrender before now. They didn't take it, not when they had the power, not when they were the ones burning our worlds, not when they were laughing as they tortured my people. His jaw tightened, the words cold and sharpened by the memory of the broadcast. So, tell me, when was mercy ever given to us? The room remained silent. The human representative looked as though he wanted to argue, to push back, but there was nothing to say. Everyone had seen the transmission. Everyone had watched the horror unfold. A representative from the Thalvoran, a species known for their neutrality, finally spoke. And now that it's over, what happens now, Admiral? Does humanity return a peace? Or have you become something else entirely? Cain considered the question. It was the only one that mattered now. They had won, but victory had reshaped them. The galaxy was afraid, and fear had a way of turning against itself. We are not conquerors, Cain said finally. We are not monsters. We never were. His eyes darkened. But let this war serve as a lesson. To those who watched and did nothing. To those who thought humanity could be chained, used, broken. There will not be a second warning. The Thalvoran representative studied him for a long moment before nodding. And what of you, Admiral? Cain exhaled, glancing toward Locke, toward the officers who had fought beside him, the soldiers who had followed him into the abyss. They were warriors now, forged in something irreversible. They had no place in peace. I led this war, he said finally, and now it's time for the war to end. The transmission cut. Locke stared at him. You're leaving? Cain nodded. There's no place for men like me anymore. You don't know that. I do. His voice was calm, certain. They need to believe humanity can still be something more than this, that we haven't lost everything. But they won't believe that if I'm still here. Locke's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Hours later, the Iron Requiem disengaged from the fleet. Cain stood alone in the command chamber, watching as the stars stretched before him. He had been a soldier. He had been a leader. He had been a monster. But now, he was something else, something undefined. His final transmission was short, sent only to the fleets under his command, to the men and women who had followed him through hell. The war is over. Do not forget what was done. Do not forget why we fought. But do not let it define us. Humanity is more than its wrath. Be more. And with that, he vanished into the void, leaving behind only the legend of the man who had burned an empire to the ground and walked away. The stars stretched endlessly before him, an ocean of light and darkness, indifferent to the war that had just reshaped the galaxy. Darius Cain sat in the dim cockpit of the Iron Requiem, alone for the first time in years. The war was over, or at least that was what they called it. But peace wasn't something he could feel, not yet, not ever. It clung to him like an ill-fitting uniform, foreign and hollow. The last message he had sent to his fleet played on repeat in his mind. Do not let it define us. Be more. It had been the right thing to say. The only thing to say. But deep down, he wondered if it was a lie. The comms panel flickered, a priority message cutting through the quiet. He debated ignoring it, letting it fade into static, but something in him was still wired for war, still prepared to answer every call. He pressed the receiver, his voice even. Cain. The face that appeared on screen was a ghost from the past. General Lorne, the man who had once mentored him, who had fought beside him, who had begged him to stop before the war spiraled into something irreversible. The man who had failed to stop him. Lorne's eyes were tired, his face heavier with age, but his expression remained unreadable. I knew you wouldn't disappear completely. Cain leaned back, arms folded across his chest. Then, you know this conversation is pointless, is it? Lorne studied him for a moment. You left the fleet. That means something. It means I know my place, Cain said. And it's not there anymore. Lorne nodded, as if he expected that answer. You were right, about the council, about the war, about everything. They watched. They let it happen. They were afraid to act, and when they finally did, it was too late. The Vraks got what they deserved. I won't deny that. But, Cain asked, already hearing the weight in his voice. But now the council is terrified of us, of humanity. The war didn't just kill the Vraks. It changed everything. We've been branded, not as heroes, not as warriors, as executioners. Cain's expression remained still. Let them call us whatever they want. It doesn't change what we had to do. It doesn't, Lorne admitted. But it does change what happens next. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. You're not the only one who left. You're not the only one who realized that peace isn't made for men like us. Some of the best soldiers I ever knew, captains, admirals, entire battalions, they're gone, vanished, and not just into retirement. Kane's fingers tapped against the armrest. Where did they go? That's the question, Lorne said. Some think they're forming something new. A faction. A legion. Not under the Dominion. Not under the Council. Just men who don't know how to stop fighting. The ones who think the war should have gone further. That we should have wiped out every last alien. Whoever lifted a weapon against us. Kane didn't move. He had known this would happen. The rage they had unleashed didn't just vanish because the war was declared over. For some, the fire had become the only thing keeping them alive. What do you want from me, Lorne? I want you to find them before they become something worse, Lorne said. Before they start the kind of war we won't be able to come back from. Kane exhaled, rubbing his fingers together. Why me? Because they'll listen to you, Lorne said. You didn't just lead the war. You became its symbol. They followed you because they believed in what you stood for. You told them to be more than their wrath. But if you don't remind them, if you don't stop them, then their wrath is all they'll ever be. Silence filled the cockpit. Kane closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the request settle. He had walked away from the war, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. But war had never been something he could escape. It found him, always. And maybe that was the truth he had been running from. Maybe that was the reason peace had never fit him. You have a location? He asked. Lorne's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something like relief. I have a lead. Kane nodded once, his decision already made before he had even spoken. Send it over. The transmission ended. And Kane leaned forward, gripping the controls, the hum of the iron requiem rising as the ship adjusted course. He had thought he had burned his last war behind him, but he should have known better. The battle wasn't over. It had just changed shape. As the ship sped into the unknown, he wondered if this was always meant to be his path. If he had ever truly been anything but a soldier. If no matter how far he ran, he would always be dragged back into the fire. Perhaps war wasn't something he fought. Perhaps war was something he was,